Robert I of Scotland, better known as Robert the Bruce, reigned as King of Scotland from 1306 to 1329. For his role in winning England's independence, Robert the Bruce has been considered a national hero and one of the greatest monarchs of all time. From Scotland. Robert succeeded John Balliol, King 1292 to 1296, but only after a tumultuous decade of lateral exchanges and military ups and downs against the English armies led by Edward I of England, King 1272 to 1307, and those of rival Scottish barons. A major victory over the English at Bannockburn in 1314 cemented Robert's claim to be the rightful King of Scotland, and his skillful diplomacy brought recognition of Scotland's full independence from both the Pope and Edward III of England, King 1327–77. Watch the video until the end to know this amazing story. Welcome to the Myths and Curiosities channel. Already leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell so you don't miss any notifications. Bruce was descended from ancestors in Brix, Flanders. In 1124, King David I granted the enormous estates of Annandale to his follower, Robert de Bruce, in order to protect the frontier. The name, Robert, was very common in the family. Born in 1274, Bruce was the grandson of another Robert Bruce, the failed claimant to the Scottish crown in 1290–2, and the son of another Robert Bruce. His mother, Marjorie, Countess of Carrick, brought him an ancient Gaelic lineage. A descendant of the Gaelic Earls of Carrick, she was a formidable operator who apparently held Bruce's father captive after he returned from the crusade, refusing to release him until he agreed to marry her. Raised in Turnberry Castle, Bruce was a product of his lineage, speaking Gaelic, Scottish, and Norman French. In 1295, he became Earl of Carrick and was no doubt convinced of his family's right to the crown of Scotland. Robert Bruce's fight for the Scottish crown wasn't entirely an enterprise born of patriotism, and while his attitude has undoubtedly changed over the years, Bruce's motives seem to be a little more selfish than that. His family's rise to royalty seemed more central to his long-term plans than Scottish liberation from English rule. The facts speak for themselves. Both Bruce and his father supported Edward I's invasion of Scotland in 1296, hoping to win the crown after Balliol's fall. They were understandably disappointed when Edward I proceeded to install himself as king. In 1297, Bruce, encouraged by Bishop Wishart, raised the standard of revolt in Irvine, the reason he was absent at the Battle of Stirling Bridge. However, the uprising failed and Bruce, rather than joining Wallace after the Scottish victory at Stirling Bridge, kept a low profile until he could determine what the English reaction would be. Bruce was also absent at the Battle of Falkirk, in which Wallace's army was devastated, but appears to have made an effort to help by burning the city of Ayr to deny it to the English as they headed south. In 1298, after the Scots defeated Falkirk, Bruce and John Comyn replaced Wallace as guardians of Scotland. They soon fell out, however, Comyn being a supporter of Balliol's claim to the throne, and Robert the Bruce was replaced a year later. He continued to fight until it looked like Balliol was about to return, then, once again, he submitted to the English king, awaiting recognition of his claim to the throne. So Bruce was not averse to switching sides in pursuit of his goal, and this was not an irregular practice among power-seeking nobles at the time. The rhetoric of the Declaration of Arbroath 22 years later, while 100 of us remain alive, we shall never, under any condition, be subject to the lordship of the English, was never Bruce's rhetoric, for he had appealed to English lordship in more than an occasion. 1304 was a pivotal year for Bruce. The death of his father made him the Bruce claimant to the throne, and the capitulation of the Scots to English attacks ended hopes for a restoration of Balliol. Edward I had conquered Scotland, but he was not expected to live much longer. Bruce began looking for allies. On February 11, 1306, Robert the Bruce met John the Red Comyn at Greyfriars Kirk in Dumfries. We don't know what they argued, but an argument broke out, swords were drawn, and Bruce stabbed the Comyn before the high altar. The Comyn murder is not believed to have been premeditated, however, Bruce was excommunicated and banished, while Scotland plunged into civil war. There was no way back. Bruce realized that he would have to begin his ascent, that force would now take precedence over diplomacy. Within 6 weeks, Bishop Wishart gave him absolution and he was hastily crowned king at Scone on March 25, 1306. It was a disastrous start to his reign. Bruce had provoked the Civil War as well as the war with England. One of his brothers was killed, while his sisters, wife and daughter were captured and imprisoned. In June 1306, Bruce's ragtag forces were defeated at Methven and he fled to the Gaelic west. There are reports of Bruce hiding on Rathlin Island, off Ireland, and in the Hebrides. It is here that he passes into legend as the dispossessed king, hiding in mountains and caves, suffering hardship for the good of the nation. However, at this point Bruce was by no means the folk hero in Scotland. Very few bishops or nobles were in his possession, and there is evidence to suggest that he threatened many of his countrymen into supporting him. It was then that Bruce changed tactics and success followed. He turned out to be a natural guerrilla commander, winning small victories at Glen Troll and Loudon Hill. In 1308, he defeated the Comyn faction at Inverary and took Aberdeen, establishing control over the northern kingdom of Perth and Dundee. He ruthlessly crushed those who opposed him, forcing them into exile, but he also knew how to reward those who approached him. The tide seemed to have turned in Robert's favor, and many common people in Scotland now turned to him as their only hope for salvation from English tyranny. Luck was also on his side. Edward I, furious with Bruce, died within sight of Scotland on a march north to crush the rebels. His successor, Edward II, who was never a match for his father, sought a 2-year truce with Bruce. By 1313, Robert was powerful enough to issue an ultimatum to Balliol's remaining supporters: join him or lose his estates. Bruce's commanders now embarked on bold attacks on the remaining English garrisons. Sir James Douglas surprised Roxburgh Castle, inspiring Thomas, Earl of Moray, to steal Edinburgh Castle. In England, Edward II had to react. In 1314, he led a massive invasion force into Scotland, where they met the Scottish army at the now famous Bannockburn, near Stirling. Bruce had carefully chosen his ground at Bannockburn, and in the battle that followed, on the 23rd and 24th of June, Bruce won a tremendous victory over a vast English army. Edward II was almost caught up in the catastrophe and narrowly escaped. Here was perhaps his greatest hour and longest-lasting memory of Robert the Bruce fighting for his nation's independence against a vastly superior English force and winning, just as Wallace had done at Stirling Bridge 17 years earlier. Bruce was now in full control of Scotland, however, he still hadn't achieved his goal. The independence of Scotland and the Bruce monarchy had not yet been recognized by the English or the Pope, and this was essential for his government to have any credence in Christendom as a whole. The Scots opened a second front when Robert's brother Edward invaded Ireland. Robert appealed to the native Irish to rise up against the rule of Edward II, and some saw this as a cynical manipulation of Gaelic sentimentality. The Dark Age kings of Alba were intensely proud of their Gaelic Irish origin, and Bruce wrote as king asking them to free our nation, meaning both Scots and Irish, from English rule. Edward Bruce may also have had a reasonable claim to high Irish royalty. He was supported by Ireland's most powerful king, Domhnall Ua Neil, a relative of Robert and Edward through his maternal grandfather. The invasion, however, was a disaster as famine ravaged Ireland, and Edward's bid for the High Kingdom ended when he was killed in 1318. On the diplomatic front, the Scots appealed to the papacy through the famous Declaration of Arbroath, but to no avail. The papacy ignored the declaration, and English recognition did not come. Bruce, now quite ill, possibly with a form of leprosy, accepted a 13-year truce with Edward II, knowing he would surely die before the end. However, another stroke of luck helped Robert fulfill his ambitions. In 1328, England was in crisis after the deposition and assassination of Edward II. Seizing the moment, Bruce launched an invasion of northern England, threatening to annex it to Scotland. His challenge could not be ignored, and the government of Edward III was forced to recognize Bruce's royalty and Scottish independence. A year later, Bruce died. Bruce's body is buried in Dunfermline Abbey, while his heart is in Melrose Abbey on the Borders. Robert was succeeded by his son, who became David II of Scotland. The new king was only 5 years old, so an opportunity presented itself for rivals in the Bruce family to try to seize power. Edward Balliol, about 1283–67, son of King John Balliol, had the support of Edward III, and David was deposed in 1332. Balliol was made king, but there was another round of musical thrones, and in late 1336, David II was back. He would rule Scotland until 1371. Meanwhile, Robert the Bruce's reputation grew increasingly as he became a favorite of medieval chroniclers and the subject of a celebrated poem, The Bruce, commissioned by the grandson of King Robert II of Scotland. King from 1371 to 1390. A century later, James III of Scotland, king from 1460 to 1488, was carrying Robert the Bruce's sword into battle. What did you think of this story? Tell me in the comments, and if you liked it, share this video and subscribe to the channel to help bring good content every day. See you in the next video.